All right, greetings friends, and welcome to week number 3 of our course on the vocation of artists. I pray this finds you well, and that you would sense that God is near you and with you, and that you would be supplied with a measure of faith, hope, and love in these trying and troubling times. So hang in there. So first week, we offered some introductory comments as it relates to the landscape of how we think about the vocation of artists. Week number 2, we explored some theological perspectives on the vocation of artists. That is, whoever it is that we confess as God. And in my case, I confess faith in one God and 3 persons, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So if that's my confession, if my confession is triune, how does that confession inform what I think about what it means to have a vocation, what it means for humans to have vocations, and more particularly what it means for artists to have this particular vocation, this summons to be a certain kind of person in the world and to do certain kinds of things that relate to this thing we call art and art making and artists. This week, we are going to tack in the direction of aesthetics. And so we're going to ask ourselves questions like, well, what is art? And how do we go about defining art? And where do our ideas come from as it relates to art making? How have how have humans in the Western tradition and Western history thought about art and what it means to be an artist? And how have they thought about it differently in different eras of Western history? Unfortunately, let me say this out loud, unfortunately we do not have time and space in this course to explore how other humans in other parts of the world, other times in history, non-Western, non-European, non-North American regions of the world, traditions might think about art and art making. We'll have just little hints and glimpses of these throughout the course. Unfortunately, we cannot do a thoroughgoing investigation of those. But all this to say that our Western perspective is particular. It's contextual. It's located. So any intention to issue assertive universal statements need to be questioned at some level. When someone says, this is what art is, and it's like, well, where did you get your idea? Well, I got my idea from the Renaissance era, the modern era, or the medieval era. Well, that's fine, but that is a particular, location in history. Not that it is automatically illegitimate, but it just needs to be held in some sense lightly, and then investigated and perhaps discovered to be a persuasive way of perceiving the arts and what it means to be an artist. So, what is art is one of the most controverted questions that people in our country, in the West, may ask, because wherever you are, whoever you are, whatever your influences may be, whatever your proclivities and personalities may be, you may arrive at a different kind of answer than your neighbor. Certainly, this is true within the worlds of the church. So, at some point in our investigation, we have to arrive at a definition. And perhaps it can only be a provisional definition, perhaps it can only be a working definition, but we need to arrive at some sense in which we are able to say with reasonable confidence, because we have considered all the relevant data and then brought it together and said, I think this is probably the most cogent, the most reasonable, the most fitting, workable understanding, identification, articulation, definition of art. And then therefore also somehow we arrive at a definition of what it means to be an artist. That is, human beings are going to do certain things with this other thing here called art, and it all revolves around what you think this is and what you think you should be doing when you're doing this kind of stuff. Now, I'm saying it in very abstract terms. So allow me to propose a working definition that I employ and I will employ for the purposes of this course. That art, if we can identify, if we can classify, if we can name it in a way that is intelligible, reasonable, cogent, I would say art is something, it's a broadly understood something, a broad range of activities that bring us into intentional and intensive engagement as human beings with the aesthetic aspect of life, the aesthetic aspect of the world, with the aesthetic aspect of creation, with the aesthetic aspect of what human beings make of the world. And by that, I mean that the arts bring us into intentional and intensive participation or experience with the physical, sensory, the affective, emotional, the imaginative, and the metaphoric aspects of our life as human beings individually and socially or communally. That is, the arts in some fashion and to different degrees of intensity foreground or concentrate our attention on sensory things, affective, emotional things, imaginative things, and metaphoric things. Allow me to illustrate. So let's take the color red. The color red is one that you find abundantly all throughout nature. Our blood is the color red. There are blood red sunsets, blood red moons, flowers can be the color red. Hey, look, there's no red here, but this is the only plant. No, actually, I have lots of plants with colors. This is one that I should actually carry. It has no red plants, but just imagine, if you will, a red flower spouting from the top of that plant. So red is a naturally occurring color in nature. Then human beings come along and they take that color, they can examine it, they can study it scientifically, they can study it historically, but eventually they're going to ask themselves, how have humans appropriated the color red? How have they incorporated it into their society, into their culture, in order to do other things? Everything from most literal representations to most, say, abstract or conceptual interpretations of the color red. So in our society, we have stoplights, and there are three colors: red and yellow and green, although, is it really green? Red is a sign, and that's all it is in a stoplight. It's a sign that says stop. There's nothing else beyond the significance of the red in the stoplight. It's simply signing to you and me when we are in our vehicles or walking or riding our bicycles or buses that we're to stop, and that's it. It's a sign. It simply represents the idea that you must stop. Now, my son has a red fire truck. Why are fire trucks in the United States of America red? That's a great question. It's a contested history. Some would say that in the late 1800s, when fire trucks in the United States were being produced, that red, there are competitions between neighborhoods or boroughs or neighborhoods of one sort or another, because they all had their local fire station. And as a way to say that we're the most awesome fire station, let's use the most expensive color that we could access or get our hands on. And it was red at the time, was a very expensive color. And so you put here as a sign of power, of significance, of impressiveness, of we matter, we're better than others. So certain associations come into play with the color red. So it's not simply that red is actually the most visible to the eye. That is, when a vehicle that is colored red comes barreling through your neighborhood or your village or your town or city, it's not simply that your eye suddenly sees, oh, that's color red, that must be a fire truck. Because in fact, scientists have said that really yellow is the one that will most forcefully catch our attention, which is why in Europe, a lot of ambulances are actually yellow. Another possible reason why fire trucks are color red is because in the early 20th century, Model T Fords were all black, and so what could be the strongest contrast with black, and so red was arrived at, and that's why fire trucks in the United States of America are red. Now, my daughter likes to play dress up, and so she has one of these little medieval red gowns, and so here you have perhaps the idea of aristocracy in the medieval or the Renaissance era. Red with this kind of velvet kind of fabric is a symbol of wealth, of power, of stature, of socioeconomic hierarchy. So, and then lots of movies. Of course, Disney movies come along, and imagine ourselves kings and queens and princesses. And so you have this red fabric, right? Now, Blythe could read about the history of medieval garments in an actual history book. or she could read about it in a storybook. Or she could have this very sensory experience. That is, her body will feel and she will wear on her body as she parades around the house, using her imagination and then evoking certain feelings of, I am special. I am somebody that matters because I am wearing this kind of garment with this kind of design. So in this sense, now we've come a little bit closer to foregrounding these aesthetic aspects of the color red. Now, icons have made, the history of icons have made use of the color red. And the history of iconography, red is associated with the Passion of Christ. Therefore, it's associated, it sort of generates this symbolic range of meanings with respect to death, with respect to life, with respect to resurrection. And so Jesus will have the red on him. Saints will wear the color red to represent symbolically the Passion of Christ, the representation of a life that is accorded or befitting the Passion of Christ. And so red will be a color that is now embedded within this visual form. This visual, now obviously it's visual and two-dimensional, three-dimensional. It's an object that I can hold. And so within Orthodox worship practices, Orthodox liturgies, you will have icons decorate, ornament, populate a specific sanctuary space as a way to draw the eye, not just the ear, because just as God has spoken, God has made himself seen, visible, and so Orthodoxy would affirm that we have a text that is written, Holy Writ, and we have holy icons. Jesus is the pure image, the true icon of God. And so for them, the eye is just as spiritually and theologically significant as the ear. And so these things are placed side by side with Holy Scripture. I do have a Bible over there, but it'll take me too long to get it. So the ear and the eye, and so this as a visual thing is with red elements is drawing the eye, and therefore acts of cognition and acts of spiritual contemplation towards the red as a way then to draw our attention and affections and life's responses to what red as passion and sacrifice and resurrection signify for us. But then you get into the mid-20th century and you get this whole history of artists in the modern 20th century Western society primarily, who are engaged in an art historical conversation, an art historical argument with one another. What is art? What's real art? What's true art? Who is a true artist? What are we really doing when we make these things called arts? And eventually you get a whole sort of generation of artists, abstract impressionists, as what you might call them. Mark Rothko would be one example. Barnett Newman would be another, in which they are interested in color red in this case, not for its didactic purposes, not because of what it can teach us, not because of what it can do in a practical utilitarian sense, as a light, a stoplight, or a fire engine, not in a teaching us a spiritual truth as in an icon, but simply for their expressive qualities. As it were, color for color's sake. We are delighting in color because color fascinates us. It evokes things in us. It evokes feelings in us. It provokes certain associations and emotions and desires in us. And so here is an example of Mark Rothko, one of his paintings. Another one which I don't have an example in my modern art book, History of Modern Art book, but Barnett Newman did a series of paintings that he titled Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow, and Blue, which is a riff on Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. And his goal, here's an example. This is not red, but these are other sort of kinds of paintings that he made as a way to reduce art to its most essential colored essence. What is art if not an experimentation, playing with color? right? Not just line, not just texture, not just, how objects are related to each other within this artificial thing called the frame, but pigments, colors, hues, varieties of shades of color. And so then they marvel, they do art for art's sake. That is, regarding color as intrinsically valuable on its own terms. This is period mid-20th century, sometimes called abstract expressionists. So here's an example of how art is, in a sense, its most intense, concentrated attention on its aesthetic qualities. That is, the visual experience, perhaps the sensory associations with pigments or color of one sort or another, and how red evokes certain emotional associations from passions. When you get mad, or if you're in love, you get flush, so there's a redness that comes. Death certainly has this association, direct association with blood, and as much as we may spill our blood, sacrifices of one sort or another have blood being spilled. So there you have this intentional and intensive attention or engagement with these aesthetic things in the artworks of the abstract expressionists. Something similar happens with Marcel Duchamp's 1917 submission of a porcelain urinal for an exhibition of the Society of Independent Artists in New York City. So an historian, a history person, a scholar in history, could write a history of hygiene and then focus on toilets. Why do we have toilets, and what are toilets, and what are the different kinds of toilets that human beings throughout different histories have employed? And then a manufacturer, an engineer and a manufacturer come along and say, well, what's going to be the most comfortable, the most effective design for a toilet for human beings to perform their necessities of one sort or another? But Marcel Duchamp, who comes into this early 20th century very heated argument about the nature of art, and an argument over against what has preceded them. And so he, along with others that are part of these avant-garde movements or Cubist movements or Dadaist movements, are in contradiction to traditional notions of taste and beauty. They're also in an argument against a movement called Futurism, which had this love affair with machines, but Marcel Duchamp and others found it to be a humorless endeavor. And so wanted to basically turn, oops, I just had a gnat fly in front of me. I had a vice presidential debate moment. Turn art upside down, inside out, and basically have an anti-art venture enterprise. Like reduce art to its most essential elements, components. And so he is wondering out loud, what does it really mean to say that artists are original in anything, or they innovate, or they make new things? Aren't we all borrowing, in a sense, taking something from somewhere else and then making something else from it, or giving it a new meaning of one sort or another? All the history of music is sort of a conversation, a dialogue all along, historical lines. And so he takes this urinal and sets it up in this space and says, this is art, as a way to say, I'm against all these other things that you all are in favor of. Now, plenty of Christians would say that's the most ridiculous, absurd thing I've ever seen. How is that art? Well, let me suggest to you that it's art in the sense of its context. I have 3 bathrooms in my house. There are toilets in each one. And the context for the toilets in our house is very clear. It's a toilet where you are doing toiletry type activities. But once that toilet is placed into a different context, in this case, an art historical context, its context is now determining and rerouting its meaning. In the same way that so many museums in Europe and in North America, you will find masks that have been taken from tribal societies where in their original context they were employed for religious, liturgical, devotional means as a way to petition, summon something from divine beings, spiritual powers of one sort or another, to invoke them for some reason, or to counter other spiritual powers. And so the mask in those contexts had a very, very particular meaning. You take that mask out and you put it on the wall of the Met Museum, is a very different thing, right? Now you are attending not to its religious significance, but to its aesthetic qualities, the shape, the design, the colors, the textures, the carvings, the this, that, and you may have some vague sense that it belonged to such and such a tribe and, the Mayan peoples in northern Guatemala. But that's not your interest in that context. Same with Marcel Duchamp. He takes this toilet, puts it into this gallery space and says, now let's have a conversation. What really is art? Okay, so those are the kinds of things. Let me give you one last example. Here's the color red. My wife and I created a series of prayer cards to correspond to my book on the Psalms. This is a book that I wrote, Open and Unafraid. The Psalms is a Guide to Life, which was asking if you could only take one book to the proverbial lonely island and it were the Psalms, what kind of human being would it make you? Would it turn you into? And then she created a series of illustrations interpreting each of the chapters that I wrote. And here's the color red of a heart, hands around it. So again, this is a visual object, a visual thing that is drawing attention to, our eyes and our emotions, and imagining what it means to be held, our broken hearts to be held by hands that care for us. That's still the red. Okay, last example. What if you wanted to teach children about the virtues of friendship? Well, you could talk about Aristotle. Aristotle, one of the great Greek philosophers of ancient civilization, has plenty to say about friendship. You could read a book about friendship. You could do a Bible study about friendship. And here you're attending to books that are intended to instruct in rational, discursive ways. Here are the principles of friendship. Here are the outcomes of friendship, the benefits of friendship. Here are the disciplines, the practices, the habits that cultivate friendship. Principles, logic, discursive, analytical, prose type approaches. But what if you want to help children to appreciate, to cultivate, to value friendship? What would you do? Well, an educator would come into a classroom and say, children, friendship, here are the 3 basic principles for being a good friend. You share, you ask for forgiveness when you've hurt someone's feelings, and you delight in the other person's interests, and vice versa. But what if you thought to yourself, that actually won't do the trick? Children really won't fully, deeply grasp the virtue of friendship unless we tell it, communicate it, help them to know it through other means. So what if you create a company and you call it the Public Broadcasting Company, and then you create a show, a television show that educates children through a means of entertainment, and you use puppets instead of real human beings in order to show what friendship is, right? So you're telling, but you're also now showing. And then you call that show Sesame Street. And so then there's a television that's using videographic means to communicate things, but you could also write books, storybooks. And now you have a book that is telling a story about what it means for these 2 puppets named Ernie and Bert to be friends together. So you're showing them through this aesthetically concentrated object. It is tactile, there are colors, there are stories, there are rhymes and poems, there's a musicality to it all. Children are being invited to use their bodies, to dance, to act things out. There's a story that Ernie tells about hunting for a tiger, and this is like a record player originally, and children were to mimic all the actions that Ernie is chronicling as he goes on a hunt for a tiger. Now, you could also have manufacturers create little plush animals as a way for children to hold in their hand, as I did when I was a wee little boy many, many, many decades ago, an object. This object has a fabric to it. There's a design which obviously is associated with Ernie. And so as I hold it as a little child, I am drawing and reminding myself of these stories, drawing these stories into my own imagination, to my own heart, to my own life, and I'm perhaps also play acting with this artistic creation, these, realities of friendship. Now, you could also write a novel, as Tolkien did in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, in which you show through literary means, through narratival art forms, in a novelistic medium, what friendship looks like. And so you're going to tell the story, you're going to show what friendship looks like through Frodo and Samwise Gamgee. And so all this to say that the arts in these different ways are bringing us, inviting us into an intentional and intensive experience of sensory things that we can see and hear and smell and taste and touch. Our affections are being drawn into purposeful, focused engagement of things. Our imaginations are being fired up, are being asked to play primary roles rather than, say, our rational faculties, which are, of course, very important. But imagination is now in the foreground. And then invited to see how the story of Frodo and Sam in The Lord of the Rings can function as a metaphor to help us understand what friendship is. Sesame Street functions like a metaphor that friendship is akin to, is like unto, is a way to figure out the nature of friendship. These are the kinds of things that I write about at length in the essay that you read this week. You will also read an essay by Jamie Smith that then sort of does more of a philosophical treatment of storytelling. J.K. Rowling's small book comes from a commencement address that she gave at a university here in the States on the nature of imagination and the benefits of failure. And then there's an animated piece on Ian McGilchrist's large book on the right brain and left brain. So all these are a way for you to have a clearer, more precise sense of this range of definitions, a range of understandings of what art is. And at some point, you have to arrive at your own convictions. I'm going to say this is art, and then somewhere over here, this is probably not art, and this is most definitely not art. And hopefully we can do this in careful and charitable ways. Okay, thoughts for this week, video lecture. Looking forward to engaging with you online. Bless you guys, and we'll look forward to seeing you here, there, and everywhere.